Before a single frame of Fargo appears on screen, the Coen brothers have already lied to you. White text materializes against darkness, declaring with complete certainty that what you are about to watch is a true story. The words carry the weight of a sworn statement, explaining that out of respect for the survivors and the dead, names have been changed, but everything else occurred exactly as depicted. Audiences across the world sat in theaters and believed they were watching a dramatized recreation of real events. They paid closer attention. They leaned forward. They took the absurd, darkly comic horror unfolding before them as something that had genuinely happened to real people in the frozen heart of Minnesota. And the Coen brothers, Joel and Ethan, said absolutely nothing to correct that impression for years. The truth behind that opening statement is one of the boldest acts of cinematic deception ever committed. Nearly everything in Fargo, the kidnapping plot, the criminals, the desperate car salesman, the relentlessly polite police chief, all of it came from the brothers' imagination. They crafted the false claim deliberately, convinced that audiences would engage more deeply with strange events if they believed those events had actually occurred. The absurdity would feel less like comedy and more like a document of how chaotic and darkly funny real life can actually be. Their instinct proved correct, though the deception itself became one of the most talked about tricks in film history. The brothers later acknowledged drawing loose inspiration from crime stories they had heard growing up in Minnesota, but no actual case bore any meaningful resemblance to what ended up on screen. By lying in the first 10 seconds, they created a mythology around their film that made every uncomfortable laugh feel slightly guilty. What makes the film's illusion of reality even more remarkable is how much went wrong during its creation. The movie that looked so carefully composed and deliberately frozen was actually held together in many places by improvisation, desperation, and last-minute decisions made under extraordinary pressure. The secrets that live behind those snow-covered scenes reveal something that film schools should study, which is that great filmmaking often happens despite chaos rather than because everything went according to plan. Frances McDormand, who was married to Joel Coen, received the script from Marge Gunderson and felt genuinely uncertain about it. The character seemed like a trap. A heavily pregnant small-town police chief with an exaggerated Midwestern accent who investigated brutal crimes, while remaining relentlessly cheerful and polite. McDormand worried that audiences would find Marge ridiculous rather than compelling, that the folksy speech patterns and obvious warmth would tip the character into parody. She hesitated, which was remarkable given that her husband had written the role. The Coens spent real time working to change her mind, convincing her that the character's intelligence and humanity would emerge through performance rather than being swallowed by the quirks. McDormand eventually trusted their vision, and what followed was one of the most celebrated performances in American cinema. Had she followed her first instinct and walked away, the entire structure of the film would have collapsed. Everything that makes Fargo work rests on Marge being completely real, and that reality came from an actress who almost never agreed to play her. The story of how William H. Macy Secure's role as Jerry Lundegaard is one of the more extraordinary tales of stubborn ambition in Hollywood history. The Coens were looking for someone who could inhabit a particular kind of man, desperate, deceptive, pathetic, and somehow darkly funny all at once, without ever letting the character tip fully into villain or buffoon. Macy auditioned and did not get a clear answer. Rather than accepting that silence as rejection, he launched what can only be described as a campaign of determined harassment. He flew himself to New York at his own expense to audition again when he heard they were still looking. At some point during this process, he made the extraordinary move of telling the Coens that if they did not cast him, he would track down their dog and end its life. This threat, delivered as a joke and somehow landing perfectly as one, demonstrated exactly the quality they needed. There was desperation in it, and dark comic energy, and a willingness to go further than anyone expected. The brothers later admitted that Macy's relentless pursuit helped his case significantly, because it showed in precise, frantic energy that Jerry Lundegaard needed to have. The performance he delivered, a man drowning by inches in his own bad decisions, ranks among the finest work in crime cinema. Steve Buscemi brought his own ambitions to the role of Carl Showalter, though his desires took a different form. Before filming began, Buscemi approached the Coens with a request for a significant physical transformation. He wanted alterations to his appearance that would give Carl a more theatrical, distinctive look. The Coens rejected this immediately and completely. They explained that Carl needed to look ordinary unintimidating, like a small-time criminal who talked too much and believed himself to be considerably smarter and tougher than he actually was. The character's unimpressive appearance was precisely the point. Buscemi's natural look already gave him everything they needed, which was a face that inspired neither fear nor respect, making Carl's constant bluster simultaneously funny and sad. Their instinct proved exactly right. The performance, without any physical disguise, became one of the film's most memorable elements. The portrait of a man whose mouth continually writes checks his body cannot cash. If Buscemi's Carl runs on too many words, Peter Stormare's Gerhard Grimsrud operates in almost complete silence, and that silence was a deliberate choice that came late in the process. Early draft of the script gave the character considerably more dialogue, imagining a more balanced criminal partnership where both men spoke with relative frequency. The Coens gradually recognized that something more unsettling could emerge from stripping Gerhard nearly silent. They removed line after line from the character until only the barest fragments remained. What this created was remarkable, because each of Gerhard's rare spoken moments carries enormous weight precisely because he almost never speaks. His silence suggests depths of violence and unpredictability that no amount of menacing dialogue could convey. Stormare had to communicate everything through physicality and expression, which he did with terrifying effectiveness. The Coens' willingness to remove language from a character until almost nothing remained produced one of cinema's most memorable quiet villains. To maintain the tension of their uneasy criminal partnership, Buscemi and Stormare made a deliberate decision off camera as well. They chose not to bond during production, maintaining genuine emotional distance from each other throughout filming. This was not an accident or a personality conflict. It was a professional strategy aimed at preserving the authentic discomfort their scenes required. By avoiding the natural friendship that develops between actors who spend long hours together on set, they kept their interactions feeling strained and volatile. The tension that permeates every scene they share together is not entirely performed. It grew from a real absence of warmth between two performers who understood that genuine chemistry would have undermined what the film needed from them. The most iconic image in Fargo, the one that burns itself into a viewer's memory and refuses to leave, was not filmed the way the Coens intended. A character feeding human remains into a wood chipper while snow falls softly around them, creating an almost obscene contrast between peaceful winter atmosphere and grotesque violence, was supposed to be staged differently. The brothers had specific angles and lighting approaches planned that would have created a more controlled and deliberate visual effect. When they arrived at the location of film, they discovered that melting snow and terrain problems made their original setup impossible to execute. Rather than postponing or finding a different location, they adapted on the spot. The improvised version that exists in the finished film ended up feeling rawer and more disturbing than anything their polished original concept would have produced. What began as a production failure became cinema's most haunting image. That melting snow represented one of the production's most serious ongoing crises. A film set in the brutally frozen heart of a Minnesota winter requires winter, and the weather decided not to cooperate with remarkable consistency. Unseasonably warm temperatures arrived in the middle of production, and snow that had blanketed locations for weeks began disappearing. The continuity problems this created were severe. Scenes filmed on the same supposed day needed to match each other visually, but patches of bare ground were appearing overnight where there had been solid white coverage. The crew began trucking in snow from colder regions, a genuinely expensive and time-consuming operation, to redress outdoor locations before filming. Camera angles were chosen in some scenes specifically to hide bare patches that could not be covered in time. The irony that a film celebrating Minnesota's punishing winters nearly fell apart because of warmth was not lost on anyone involved. The crew's determination to maintain the illusion of frozen desolation despite nature's non-cooperation is visible in the seamless final product. The crew suffered in other ways too. On days when actual cold arrived, it arrived completely. Temperatures dropped well below zero during outdoor shoots, and equipment began malfunctioning in ways that created constant delays. Camera lenses frosted over. Crew members struggled to operate equipment with numb hands. Breaks had to be scheduled specifically to allow people to warm up before returning to filming, adding time to an already complicated schedule. Some crew members developed minor frostbite, despite precautions. Others battle persistent illness from extended cold exposure. The genuine suffering that the crew endured translated directly into the film's atmosphere, because a cold that permeates every outdoor scene is not a lighting effect or a color grade. It is actual cold, felt by everyone present, and it shows. Frances McDormand's preparation for Marge involved more than finding the character from inside. She spent significant time with actual Minnesota policewomen, observing how they moved and carried themselves, how they balanced authority with particular warmth of Midwestern culture, how they stood and positioned their hands during questioning, and the specific tonal qualities they used to maintain control without aggression. The details she gathered were subtle rather than dramatic, but they accumulated into something that made Marge feel genuinely professional in ways that no amount of imagination alone could have produced. Her research prevented the character from becoming a caricature of a folksy cop, grounding performance in observed reality. Managing her character's physical presence added an additional layer of technical challenge. McDormand wore a prosthetic belly throughout filming to portray Marge's advanced pregnancy, and the appliance caused near-constant problems. It shifted position between takes, sagged in ways that did not match earlier footage, and sat wrong under her uniform with infuriating regularity. The wardrobe team fought daily battles to keep the prosthetic correctly positioned and visually consistent across scenes filmed days or weeks apart. Physical scenes where Marge moved quickly or bent forward were particularly difficult. Despite this ongoing backstage struggle, McDormand incorporated the artificial weight into her movement so naturally that the pregnancy reads as completely real. Her waddle and physical adjustments feel lived in because she committed to them fully regardless of what was happening beneath her uniform. The accent that became one of the film's most debated elements turned out to be more accurate than almost anyone expected. Many viewers and critics assumed the Coens and their cast had deliberately exaggerated Midwestern speech patterns for comic effect, stretching real accents into caricature to heighten the film's dark humor. Linguists who studied the performances discovered the opposite. The accent work was remarkably faithful to how people in rural Minnesota and North Dakota actually spoke during that period. Experts noted that, if anything, the filmmakers had moderated the real accent rather than amplifying it. The musical quality, the drawn-out vowels, and the distinctive phrasing all reflected genuine regional speech. This commitment to authentic sound helped anchor the film's stranger moments in something recognizable and real, and it influenced how Midwestern characters will be portrayed in film and television for decades afterward. The uncomfortable hotel scene between Marge and her former classmate, Mikey Najida, has always felt oddly specific compared to the rest of the film's invented world. The encounter, awkward, sad, and strangely moving, does not connect directly to the main plot in any obvious way, and viewers have always wondered why it exists at all. The answer is that it comes from life rather than invention. One of the Coen brothers had an uncomfortably similar reunion with someone from their past during their college years, an encounter defined by desperate loneliness, inappropriate behavior, and the kind of painful social discomfort that is almost impossible to dramatize without direct experience. They held on to this memory for years before finding a story where it belonged. The scene adds something to Marge's character that no crime plot element could provide, a glimpse of ordinary human sadness that gives her compassion genuine weight. What almost closed the film was a darker ending that the Coens eventually removed. Their original script extended beyond the quiet bedroom scene between Marge and her husband Norm, dwelling longer on the emotional aftermath of everything she had witnessed, potentially showing her struggling more explicitly with the darkness she had moved through. They decided this extended bleakness unbalanced what the film needed to accomplish at its conclusion. Ending on warmth rather than lingering despair allowed the preceding violence to resonate more powerfully, because the contrast between what Marge has seen and the simple goodness she returns to says everything without saying anything. The trimming of that darker conclusion demonstrates the instinct for knowing when to stop, which is one of the rarest and most valuable qualities in filmmaking. One of the film's most essential scenes, Marge in her patrol car thinking through the case while driving, was not in the original shooting script. The Coens realized during editing that certain connections in the investigation were not landing clearly enough for audiences to follow without guidance. They wrote entirely new dialogue overnight and arranged to film the car scene under considerable time pressure. What should have been a compromised addition, a patch job written in haste to fix a structural problem, became instead one of the film's defining sequences. Marge's methodical thinking as she works through what she knows reveals her mind at its best, and the scene captures her character more completely than almost anything else in the film. The most essential things are sometimes the things nobody planned. The wooden briefcase full of cash that gets buried along a snow-covered fence line, marked only by a red ice scraper, and then left entirely unresolved by the film's ending, became one of cinema's most discussed deliberate ambiguities. The Coens never explained what happened to the money. They offered no resolution, no hint, no off-screen answer to journalists. The refusal to close that narrative loop spawned decades of fan theories. It also spawned something more physical, a real shrine built by fans near where the fictional burial was supposed to have occurred, complete with actual red ice scrapers planted in actual snow. The unresolved fortune functions as a perfect symbol of what the entire film examines: greed that leads nowhere, darkness that leaves nothing behind except an empty landscape. The wood chipper used during filming found an equally unexpected afterlife. Rather than disappearing into storage, the machine connected to the film's most disturbing sequence became a tourist attraction at the Fargo Moorhead Visitor Center, where it sits on permanent display. Tourists pose cheerfully for photographs with it. The dark ritual has become a regional institution, which says something fascinating about how deeply the film embedded itself into the identity of the place it depicts. A piece of equipment associated with graphic violence became a source of pride and celebration because a film that featured it treated the region and its people with genuine respect beneath all the darkness and comedy. Fargo did not just succeed. It changed what crime stories were allowed to be. The film demonstrated that the genre did not require glamorous criminals or coastal settings or conventional moral lessons. It showed that ordinary desperation in an unglamorous place, observed with dark humor and genuine humanity, could produce something more disturbing and more lasting than anything built on genre convention. Television absorbed this lesson deeply. Breaking Bad's portrait of escalating catastrophe driven by masculine desperation owes clear debts to what the Coens demonstrated. The Fargo television series built an entire continuing universe from a film's approach. Any crime drama that finds humor in darkness or takes small-town America seriously as a setting for moral complexity carries the film's influence somewhere inside it. The secrets behind Fargo's creation reveal that the masterpiece was built as much from improvised solutions and desperate problem-solving as from the careful craft visible in the finished film. Melting snow forced improvisation that produced iconic images. Misbehaving prosthetics were absorbed into a performance that made them invisible. A scene written overnight under pressure became essential. Casting battles produced exactly the right performers. The lies told in the opening seconds created a truth that the film spent 2 hours earning. What the Coen Brothers made in the frozen chaos of a Minnesota winter was a film that would still be studied, imitated, and argued about decades later because they trusted that regional specificity and honest darkness could carry an audience somewhere that formula never reaches.